Good morning. I'm Pastor Josiah Black from First Baptist Church, Peru, and this is our ongoing weekly Bible study. And today we're actually going to be talking about the book of Habakkuk. Now, today's kind of an intro episode, if you will. So I'm going to give you some background information about this book. We're going to talk a little bit about it structurally and historically, and then that'll set us up for next week when we'll actually dive in sort of with both feet to the study of the book. Okay? So, Habakkuk. What's going on? What are we doing here? Where is it happening? Who wrote it? All the kind of information that would help us understand it better. Well, first of all, what we know or what we think we know about Habakkuk, the author, that is the prophet, is that he was probably a court musician of some kind. In Habakkuk 3, he talks about using his own stringed instruments for the song, which we'll talk structurally about that in a minute. But probably a temple musician or a court musician of some kind, someone with some sense of religious function, but also who was primarily a musical person. So kind of an interesting thing to know about them. He was a contemporary of Nahum, Zephaniah, and Jeremiah. So he existed around the same time that those individuals existed. So we're looking historically at the period where the kingdom of Judah was getting ready to fall to Babylon. So that's kind of the setting of all of this, the things that have kind of come to pass and that are going on in Judah at the time. So Judah is on the precipice of collapse. It is about to go. And this is sort of it would be a trying time for anyone, certainly for the life of someone who was a person of faith or a worship leader of some kind. So that's pretty much who Habakkuk is as far as we know. Now, obviously, the book isn't about him, so he doesn't go out of his way to tell us a lot of details. These are things that have been picked up contextually by scholars, things like the statement I mentioned in Habakkuk 3, where he talks about using his own stringed instruments. It's also in the way he writes and in just the time period that he existed in. You know, that's kind of how we kind of zero in on anything that we can know about him. But ultimately, he isn't the point. Knowing who he is, though, will help us better understand the point and what's being argued and articulated and spoken. So structurally, Habakkuk's a really interesting book because it's essentially his dialogue, his back and forth with God. Chapter 1 includes an initial complaint. It includes Yahweh's response. It includes another sort of complaint or petition. I use complaint loosely. Complaint, I think in our context, sounds kind of whiny. In Habakkuk's context, it's, hey, I see something that does not seem to square with who you are, God, and I'm bringing that to you. That's really what Habakkuk does here. So chapter 2 includes the tail end of Habakkuk's second complaint and his sort of resolve to wait and hear what God has to say. And then the rest of chapter 2 is really a long response on God's part. And then chapter 3 is a song that Habakkuk has composed to Yahweh. It's a song that reflects their conversation. It's a song that reflects his relationship and understanding of God. It's a song that is both sorrowful and hopeful. And so it's important that we understand that switch there. So you've got chapter 1, chapter 2, conversation, essentially the back and forth between Habakkuk and God. And then we have a song in chapter 3. So it's an interesting structure, and we'll of course dig into those things as we actually get in and study a specific text. When we look at the specific verses, we will start talking about that. So some things that are going on in history at the time that this was written, as I mentioned before, this is right around the fall of Judah. So we know that Jehoiakim, sorry, I checked my notes. Jehoiakim was ruling in Israel. We know that the Babylonians have already started their attack on Israel. We'll talk about how we know that a little bit more. And then in the book also, Yahweh is going to at one point promise the defeat of the Babylonians, which eventually the Persians would rise up and conquer Babylon. So that's actually predicted in this book. So we'll find that a little later as we get into it. I think Habakkuk's an important book. This was one that was requested a while ago by someone in the comments, but I think it's important because Habakkuk's also really about faith. It's about how challenging it is to keep your faith when the things around you seemingly do not reflect the goodness of God, right? It's about what faith means in a challenging season. It's about what faith means when you don't have good things happening that sort of prop that up for you. It's about essentially coming to the end of your rope. Because I think it's fair to say, even if we don't do it perfectly, when we are materially blessed, when we aren't in danger, when there isn't a great need in front of us, when we are emotionally well and we aren't suffering, it's easier to be a person of faith in some ways. Now, we might fall off in our practice because we're too comfortable. We kind of go the other way, right? When it gets too easy, we get a little out of touch. But the point is that we usually don't have crises of faith when we are at the peak, when we are feeling fulfilled and things are going well. We tend to have crises of faith when we are at our lowest or when things around us are falling apart. So Habakkuk is very much about a person, Habakkuk, who comes to the end of their rope. The goodness of God does not seem to be around them. There seems to be injustice and violence and wrongdoing and all kinds of terrible things. And this is really Habakkuk calling out to God, why? Why is this happening? So I think it's a very prescient concern for us, because I think a lot of the things Habakkuk was seeing, we see in one way or another. Now, for Habakkuk, it was real, right? His nation was about to collapse. And because he lived in a theocracy, because Jerusalem was a theocracy, the collapse of his nation would have also potentially meant the collapse of his faith. So he was worried about those two things. What's going to happen to my people? What's going to happen to me? What's going to happen to our relationship with God? All those questions were in the mix for him. I think for us, particularly as Americans, we aren't really worried about the nation just actually being carried off right now. We are not under attack from a superior enemy. We aren't living in those kind of conditions. But we do see things going on in culture that concern us. We see things that are happening that seem to be counter to Christian morals. We see things that might be make us worry that there's a sort of a moral decline happening or something along those lines, where we might be concerned in our neighborhoods or in our communities about particular crimes or things that are going on. So there are all kinds of things around us that might not be as dire as Habakkuk's circumstances were, but that undoubtedly will cause us distress. I think certainly for all of us, and we're tired of saying it at this point, right? But the events of the last year and a half, almost 2 years, COVID, things of that nature, when those things happen, it's reasonable and normal to say, God, what's going on? Where are you? Why is this happening? And I think there are probably pieces of Habakkuk that'll speak to that too. So yeah, ultimately, Habakkuk is a book about a man who hits the end of his rope and sees the world falling apart around him and holds that up to God and says, God, what do you have to say about this? And God meets those questions and answers them and does not treat Habakkuk poorly for having asked. Okay. I think that's another important point we can take with us too, is that Habakkuk is asking God to explain what's going on in the world, and God isn't punishing him for that. He doesn't treat that as a lack of faith. He treats that as something that's welcome and important, and he uses Habakkuk to then prophesy to the rest of the nation. So that's what's going on in Habakkuk. It's a good book. And one thing I'm going to suggest is, if you're watching this and you're planning to participate in our study, it's really short. It's 3 chapters. So I'd really suggest you go ahead and go read that. Okay. Read that, those 3 chapters sometime between now and next week, so that when you come in, it'll be fresh in your mind. And even though we'll take it in little bites at a time, you'll have a sense overall of where this thing's going and what's being said in there. So hopefully you can start to make the connections as we go and see those bigger themes. So I'm excited to get into this one. Thank you for listening to my little spiel today. I tried not to go down too many rabbit holes, but I know I went down a few. So your patience is appreciated. But this time next week, we will dive in. We'll be looking at Habakkuk 1, and we'll do a handful of verses from the start of that and really start getting into this thing. So as always, thank you for joining. And I will have a discussion question posted with this video, but I know folks don't always like to interact with those, but if something strikes you, share it. Okay. I love responding. I love talking about these things. So if something strikes you about just this intro conversation, or if you have a question about the context or how we know what we know, those sorts of things, put them out there, because it's a lot of fun to dive into that and to discuss it together. So thanks again, and I'll see you soon.